foi levado para o encontro com o chefe da quadrilha, Elias Maluco, que decidiu executá-lo na favela da Grota. Antes, os bandidos torturaram o repórter, que teve o corpo esquartejado e queimado.
This is the house where the slain journalist lived alone. Her dead body was found in the bathroom with signs that she had received powerful blows to the face and that she was strangled.
June 2nd, 2002, Brazilian journalist Tim Lopes went undercover into the ghettos of Rio de Janeiro to expose the illicit drug trade and prostitution in the area. However, two men would abduct him and take him to this isolated location, where he paid the price for interfering with their operations. Here, 5 Times TV reporters messed with the wrong cartel.
Fama, dinheiro e poder. Poucas mulheres na Colômbia experimentaram o sucesso e o glamour como Virginia Vallejo, mas nenhuma caiu em desgraça como ela.
Soy Virginia Vallejo. Esta semana en Noticias les contaré sobre mi historia de amor y odio con Pablo Escobar.
Love, crime, and hatred. These are the 3 words that pretty much describe how Virginia Vallejo went from being this ordinary news reporter to a fugitive in her own country. January 1983, Virginia brings on her show Pablo Escobar, becoming the first person to ever bring him into the public eye. And she portrays him as a man of the people, igniting his media presence in Colombia. But what began as this groundbreaking interview would soon entangle her in a web of power, danger, and betrayal that would shape her life over the next 5 years. Born August 26, 1949, Virginia came from a privileged background in Cartago, Valle del Cauca, Colombia. Her family, steeped in influence and wealth, boasted writers, ministers, and ambassadors, ensuring that money was never a concern. In the 1960s, Vallejo started as an English teacher, but fate would soon pull her into the spotlight as a television host in Colombia. Her talents quickly made her a sought-after figure in the industry, despite her parents' disapproval. In those days, it was rare for women of her social standing to venture into entertainment. But Virginia didn't care about that, so she pressed on. And by the late 70s, she was a recognized TV reporter across South America. But it was at this point that her life took an unexpected turn. Virginia always had a rocky romantic life. Apart from going through divorce twice, she would date some of Colombia's future billionaires, including Julio Mario Santo Domingo, Carlos Ardila Luya, and Luis Carlos Sarmiento Angulo, all of whom became heads of Colombian conglomerates. But it was while dating the nephew of then Mexican President Julio Cesar Turbe Ayala that she met Pablo Escobar for the very first time. In 1982, she and her fiancé, Ardila Luya, were invited to experience the notorious allure of Pablo Escobar's private zoo at Hacienda Nápoles, and what started like a seemingly casual visit takes a dramatic turn when she's caught the eye of the infamous drug lord himself. Escobar, intrigued by her charm, kept in touch. However, it wasn't until he saw her in the mesmerizing Medias de Lido pantyhose commercial, which had all of Colombia riveted, that his interest truly deepened. Her beauty was striking, and her physique was one to die for. Yet these weren't the only things that attracted Escobar. He recognized her media presence and figured it would be very instrumental in building his empire.
Nadie en el mundo me ha hecho a mí más feliz de lo que me hizo Pablo. Pablo es el hombre fuera del hombre que amo y que ya no me puede escuchar ni me puede reconocer. Está en un estado en el que no me puede reconocer. Fuera de él, que para mí es sagrado, el ser que más feliz me hizo a mí hasta el año de 1990 fue Pablo.
6 months after having him on her TV show, 33-year-old Vallejo began an affair with Escobar. She was drawn to his good side, which entailed helping poor families and building infrastructure for his people. Escobar was married, and she was a celebrity, forcing them to meet in middle-class homes in Bogota, Colombia's capital. And at the start of their relationship, she had no idea about his shady dealings until he confessed some of those crimes to her, including murdering over 200 people. Escobar would feel so comfortable around her that he told her about the drug trade and bombarded her with almost anything money could buy. She was flying privately, got the most luxurious items, and everything just seemed so perfect. However, after over a year of dating the world's most notorious drug lord, Virginia soon realized that she'd probably made the worst mistake of her life. After photos of Escobar loading cocaine into a plane surfaced, he grew extremely violent to everyone, including Virginia. He took her to one of his hideouts, where he continuously gagged her and throttled her neck for hours. By this time, Escobar was waging war against the Colombian government to fight his extradition to the U.S. He got his best sicarios to take out judges, politicians, police officers, and even presidential candidates. And by 1989, he would even orchestrate the infamous Avianca Flight 203 bombing that killed 107 people. Escobar was getting paranoid about the prospect of ending up in a U.S. prison, believing that anyone or anything could be used against him by the U.S. government. And driven by this fear, he told his top man to tap Vallejo's phone, break into her apartment to get those tapes of the interview, and snatch $30,000 from the safe. He wanted to make sure she couldn't leave Colombia and potentially expose him. And as her phone was bugged, his men realized that Escobar wasn't her only lover. She was having another affair with Rafael Vieira, the then director of the Oceanarium of the Rosario Islands, and also a British aristocrat, David Patrick Metcalf. So in 1987, after 5 long years and over 2,000 meetups, Escobar and Virginia finally split. Might have been the end of the relationship, but it was the beginning of her new life as a fugitive from her own country.
Los funcionarios al más alto nivel, todos tenían relaciones con Pablo o con el cartel rival o con el narcotráfico.
Virginia knew too much. Escobar had confided in her about the Colombian government's deep ties to the drug trade, and now members of his cartel, his rivals, and even high-ranking politicians were frantically trying to silence her before she spilled the secrets. Using her influence once again, Vallejo went live on TV to expose the murky connections between Colombia's elite and the drug trade. She showed how legitimate businesses would help out launder drug money and how society would welcome drug lords, and of course how politicians would trade favors for cash-filled briefcases. Virginia directly implicated several top politicians, including former presidents Alfonso López Álvaro Uribe and Ernesto Sampe, in benefiting from cartel activities. Virginia detailed their corrupt dealings with Escobar, including a shocking request from a former justice minister to eliminate a presidential candidate. So by shedding light on this hypocrisy of Colombia's upper class, Virginia was in grave danger, a target to be assassinated. But to her luck, the DEA, seeing she could be of great help in shutting down the entire cocaine trade from Colombia, whisked her away to the U.S., where she was granted political asylum. And on the day of her departure in 2006, 14 million people watched on TV as she boarded the plane that would take her away from Colombia. 2 years later, she revealed details of how former presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán was actually killed on Pablo Escobar's orders.
Por amor de Dios, ¿ante quién iba yo a denunciar que había oído a Santofimio instigar a Pablo? Todo el mundo sabía que Pablo quería matar a Luis Carlos Galán. Lo sabía Luis Carlos Galán, pero sobre todo lo sabía el general Maza Márquez. Yo no tenía que cuidar a Luis Carlos Galán. Luis Carlos Galán tenía un ejército de 125 personas porque sabía que Pablo Escobar lo tenía sentenciado a muerte.
Virginia is somewhere in the U.S. to this day, wary of the dangers she might face if she ever returns to her homeland.
Yo no podría renegar jamás de ese amor que me tuvo y de ese amor que yo le tuve a él. Eso es realmente la historia de una pasión enorme y que además es histórica por el contexto en el que se da, ¿no?
Hundreds of protesters in the Mexican state of Veracruz have marked the anniversary of the death of a journalist they claim was murdered because of her work. Impunity. It's incredible the way in which they carried out the investigation and presented the results to us.
For a reporter of her caliber, you'd think it'd be nearly impossible for Mexican cartels or even corrupt officials to target her. But when it comes to cartels, nothing's off limits, even pressuring the government to silence that murder and cover it up for 12 long years. In 2010, Regina Perez was one of the most prolific reporters in Veracruz, Mexico. Yet just 2 years later, she was mysteriously murdered, leaving behind one of the most baffling and disturbing cases of a journalist's death in Mexico's history. So what exactly happened to her? Born September 7th, 1963, Regina Martinez Perez was raised in the small town of Rafael Lucio, Veracruz. She lived with her parents, Maria Lorenza Perez Vasquez and Florencio Martinez Romero, along along with her 10 siblings. And from a young age, Regina always wanted to be a journalist. She would even study journalism at the Universidad Veracruzana. And after getting her degree, she would move to the city of Chiapas to work as a reporter for Mexican rural television. However, while working there, she realized that being a journalist wasn't as easy as she might have imagined. First off, she had to deal with some lousy working conditions. On top of this, the company kept censoring her work. So fed up, Regina tried her luck with other news outlets, but things weren't getting any better. The censorship was out of control. Looks like top government officials would censor out anything that had to do with shady cartel connections. Regina had like 63 reports loaded with evidence against the Veracruz government, putting both her career and life on the line. I mean, honestly, anyone who hired her back then was basically asking for trouble. Yet after jumping from one outlet to the other, she would finally land at this news magazine that would change her life for the better and for worse. In 2000, Regina would start working for the Mexican news magazine Proceso. This magazine, much like Regina, would publish articles exposing corrupt politicians, not just in Veracruz, but all across Mexico. And it was during her time here that she became widely known in Mexico for her sharp criticism toward the government. And as she continued to work, she would dive deeper and deeper into the narcotics underworld, a decision that would tragically lead to her death. Now, one thing you need to know is that in Veracruz, a few cartels run the show, and the infamous Sinaloa cartel is one of them. There was a turf war with the Gulf cartel going on for years, and in recent times the Zetas have joined that bloodbath. Now, the reason why Veracruz has become so popular for these cartels is because it's a great drug smuggling corridor going right into the U.S. It also has one of Mexico's busiest ports, allowing millions of dollars worth of cocaine to get transported monthly. So you can imagine every official in the state, including the government, wants a piece of that pie. But Regina's over here thinking that she can cripple their corrupt circle. In her final few years, she would write extensively about two former Veracruz state governors, Fidel Herrera and Javier Duarte, detailing their ties to the crime underworld. In one report, she talks about how Herrera had met up with Zeta's cartel leaders at a hotel, and also at one of his many lavish parties in Veracruz. She would blast him for investing millions of state-allocated funds into a failed soccer team owned by a friend. Her report also coincided with a former FBI special agent who claimed that Herrera was paid millions of dollars by cartels for impunity in their operations across the state. And we can go on and on about the bombshell story she dropped every other day, but that wouldn't be necessary. You pretty much get the point here. I mean, she just kept dropping report after report, and the Veracruz government did something totally insane. Now, while Regina was investigating mass graves used by cartels to dispose of bodies, she started sensing that she was being watched. And it turned out she was right. The Veracruz government had set up a secret unit to monitor critics and journalists. These spies were gathering information on journalists and reporters who opposed the government, including their family names, places of work, and even sexual orientations. Now, Regina began noticing strange noises coming out of that phone, and when she got back from this one vacation, she saw her house had been broken into. But would this stop her from making reports? No, and they figured the only way to silence her was to take her out. April 28, 2012, her lifeless body was discovered in her bathroom, with authorities concluding that her death was the result of strangulation. Her neighbor was worried about her door being open and proceeded to call the cops. And then the Veracruz governor Javier Duarte denied having anything to do with her death. But as time went on, the truth came out. Months after her death, two men, Jorge Antonio Hernandez Silva and Jose Adrian Hernandez Dominguez, were charged as her murderers. Silva confessed to the murder, stating that he and Dominguez were friends with Regina before she died. But on one occasion when they went to visit her, Dominguez grew angry and began beating Regina, plunging her head into a toilet bowl and hitting it repeatedly. He would also confess that Regina tried defending herself with a kitchen knife by stabbing one of them in the forearm, but they would eventually overpower her and strangle her to death. Now that's a detailed confession, right? Well, it seemed that way to us at first, but when Silva faced a judge, he retracted that statement, claiming that he had been beaten by Veracruz officers, held captive for over a week, and coerced into confessing to the assassination. He would argue that the officers wanted to make it look like Regina's death had nothing to do with her work, and also denied that he and Dominguez were involved in her murder. Despite his retraction, Silva was sentenced to 38 years in prison for that murder. However, However, many think he was wrongfully convicted. The case was abruptly closed right after that sentencing, leaving no room for a deeper investigation into his allegations of being forced to confess. April 28, 2024 would mark 12 years since her death, and Mexicans are still demanding answers.
Todas las noches estoy asomándome a la calle. He tenido que evitar con mi familia. No soy periodista del silencio. Quiero seguir viviendo, quiero seguir respirando. Morir sería dejar de escribir.
May 15, 2017, Javier Valdez Cardenas was gunned down in broad daylight, shot 12 times by this unknown assailant in Culiacan, Sinaloa. This man spent decades fearlessly exposing the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel. But the question here is, how did it all unfold? Born April 14, 1967, in the very city where he would later meet his tragic end, Cardenas grew up surrounded by violence that defined Sinaloa. The streets were teemed with cocaine, meth, kidnappings, and human trafficking, but unlike many of his peers who were drawn into this underworld, Cardenas chose a different path. Armed with a degree in psychology from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa, he embarked on a career in journalism, landing his first gig with the national TV station Canal 3. And that, people, was when things began to get interesting. Throughout the 90s, Cardenas worked with various news stations, and he would quickly grow frustrated with their timid approach to reporting on organized crime. They weren't corrupt, they were just smart and cautious. So, determined to tell the truth, he founded his own newspaper, Rio Doce. With this, he could expose the secrets of the criminal underworld. But he would also have a target on his back. Now, Cardenas couldn't care any less. He continued publishing hard-hitting stories and books, including the internationally recognized Miss Narco, which talked about the women that lived with drug lords. To understand the danger Cardenas faced, consider this one. When Felipe Calderón became president, he sent 6,000 Mexican army soldiers to Michoacán and Sinaloa to root out corruption, right? And that resulted in a bloody conflict which claimed over 14,500 lives in just 3 years. And amidst all that chaos, Cardenas continued to dig deep into the Sinaloa cartel's operations, without guns or bodyguards, until they eventually struck back. In September 2009, a grenade was thrown into Rio Doce's offices, causing significant damage. That came 24 hours after Cardenas published a controversial piece titled Hitman, Confession of an Assassin in Ciudad Juarez. But despite the danger, he still refused to back down. And surprisingly, the attack ceased, even though the death threats to his family continued. In 2011, Cardenas was honored with the International Press Freedom Award by the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York. And during his acceptance speech, he condemned the violence plaguing Mexico, criticizing both the government and citizens for fueling the war. Well, that infuriated the Mexican government, but more dangerously put him back in the cartel's crosshairs. So on May 15, 2017, the inevitable happened. Javier Valdez Cardenas was ruthlessly shot 12 times, just blocks away from Rio Doce's office. The killers left no trace, no suspects, no leads, nothing. His murder sparked outrage, drawing condemnation from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, the UN, and the EU. He left behind his wife, Griselda Triana, a journalist herself, and their young daughter. But the story doesn't end here, because Rio Doce didn't die with Cardenas. It lives on, with its mission continued by two other media companies, Forbidden Stories and the German newspaper Zeit Online. Cardenas' legacy, like his unyielding pursuit of truth, remains very much alive.
Miroslava fue una mujer valiente, su crítica aguda y puntual fue siempre un referente en la opinión pública.
Se confirmó que las personas que planearon y ejecutaron este crimen pertenecen al grupo Gente Nueva, brazo armado del cártel de Sinaloa en los municipios chihuahuenses de Uruachi y Chinipas.
Around 7 a.m. on March 23, 2017, Mexican journalist Miroslava Breach was on her way to drop her 14-year-old son off at school when gunmen ambushed her vehicle, shot her 8 times, and left a note that made it clear who the killers were. Now, technically, Miroslava wasn't a TV reporter, but her work as a journalist was so remarkable that it gave her widespread recognition across Mexico for her fearless investigations and unwavering commitment to exposing the truth, even though she did pay the ultimate price with her life. But who exactly are these people she exposed? Miroslava Breach was born on August 7, 1962, in the Sierra Tarahumara Ensenada region of Chihuahua, Mexico. Her father would be a victim of Mexico's corruption. He was killed when she was just a baby, leaving her to be raised by her struggling mother. The loss of her father and her difficult childhood would ignite this deep desire to expose the hidden operations of these deadly cartels and their dealings with the Mexican government. And trust us when we say there was absolutely nothing that was going to stop her. In 1987, after getting her degree from the Autonomous University of Baja California Sur, Miroslava launched her journalism career with 2 local newspapers in Los Cabos. However, it was through this work that she uncovered a disturbing truth. Many journalists and news stations were too afraid to report on these powerful figures involved in the drug trade. Yet, still determined to expose corruption and crime, Miroslava took on the dangerous task herself, fully aware of the risks involved. March 4th, 2016, La Jornada, a newspaper Miroslava was associated with, published her article exposing cartel members who had infiltrated the candidate lists for the Institutional Revolutionary and National Action Parties in Chihuahua's drug trafficking regions. This revelation made her a target, and the newspaper distanced itself by firing her. Unfazed, she founded her own agency, MIR News, where Miroslava continued to investigate and report on human rights abuse, femicides in Ciudad Juarez, the murder of social activist Marisela Escobar Ortiz, disappearances, and even drug trafficking in Chihuahua. She also called out Chihuahua's governor, Cesar Duarte Aguez, revealing that he had a private network embezzling over $100 million during his 6 years in office. That's like over 1.9 billion pesos. But away from that story, one of her most significant investigations involved uncovering clandestine graves in El Largo Maderal and exposing failures of Sergio Almaraz Ortiz, the Secretary of Public Safety in Ciudad Juarez, which led to his removal from office. This girl covered extensively the war between Sinaloa and the Juarez cartel hitmen in Chihuahua. You gotta understand here that Miroslava was working overtime, doing things that nobody else was doing in Chihuahua. But here's the thing, as she delved deeper into these dangerous waters, she swam through death threats from both the cartels and corrupt officials, warning her to stop. But her dedication to her craft was so intense that she was ready to lay her life on the line to get justice for the people who deserved it. March 23, 2017, Miroslava was tragically shot dead in her SUV while on her way to her son's school. A note left on her body by her killer, Carlos Arturo Quintana, known as L80, a leader of the Juarez cartel's paramilitary wing, La Linea, simply read, "For being a snitch, L80." Now it looks like in her last bit of reporting she had exposed a mayoral candidate's alleged ties to the Sinaloa cartel, which caused him to lose the election. Now what made this tragedy even more disturbing was that Miroslava had sought protection for herself and her children from the government, but her pleas were denied. And after her death, the governor of Chihuahua, Javier Valdez, claimed that she had never requested security, despite clear evidence showing otherwise. Further investigations uncovered that Hugo Ahmed Schultz Alcaraz, the former mayor of Chinipas in Chihuahua, was involved in her murder, along with some other corrupt politicians tied to drug cartels. Yet the true shooter remains at large.
Ele estava fazendo uma reportagem na Vila Cruzeiro, na Penha, usando uma câmera escondida. O jornalista investigava a presença de menores e a venda de drogas em um baile funk quando foi descoberto.
June 2nd, 2002, Brazilian journalist Tim Lopes ventures into lawless Rio de Janeiro ghettos, where drug deals and child prostitution run rampant. Armed with a small microphone and a hidden camera, he tries to blend in, but drug traffickers quickly see through his disguise. They kidnapped him and took him to an isolated location where his fate took a dark and tragic turn, leaving Brazilians with a haunting memory that will never fade. Before that, Tim Lopes, real name Arcano Antonio Lopes do Nascimento, was born and raised in Pelotas, Brazil. He was the fourth out of 12 children, and at the age of 8, he would move to Rio de Janeiro with his family, where he got inspired to become a journalist. But this desire didn't just come out of thin air. It came with his family settling in a 3-room shanty in the Mangueira favela. Mangueira fascinated young Lopes's mind learned and he witnessed a few things that he thought the world needed to know about. So as a teenager, he enrolled in the Facultad Elio Alonso Journalism School, and a couple of years later started his career as a writer for Rio newspapers O Globo, O Dia, and Jornal do Brasil. His ability to write captivating stories and turn small events into major headlines made Lopes a favorite amongst locals, and soon enough he won a Brazilian journalism award called the Prêmio Abril de Jornalismo for 2 years in a row. And as good as all that sounds, Lopes still wasn't satisfied with his accomplishments, leading him to venture into a more mainstream yet dangerous aspect of journalism, which was going undercover to get stories for news stations. During one of his first assignments in 1995, Lopes posed as a street vendor in Rio with a camera concealed in a cooler. The investigation aimed to show the dangers faced by everyday citizens in the area, as people are getting mugged and assaulted on a daily basis. And just as expected, Lopes captures a very vile scene that's just too gory for us to show you on YouTube. The video shows a couple getting mugged in Rio's central business district, with one of the attackers brandishing a large knife. A taxi driver who witnessed the event would bring out his revolver and fire it off to scare the teens, but that took a wild turn because one teen fled into oncoming traffic and was tragically struck and killed by a city bus. The incident haunted Lopes for a long time, but conversely it took his career to a higher level, a level where he instantly became a threat to drug cartels in Brazil. 1996, Lopes becomes a producer for the TV news network Rede Globo, where he and his team covered more daring investigations into Brazil's drug trafficking ring. They would launch an investigative series titled Ferial das Drogas, which translates to Big Drug Fair. In the series, Lopes, still utilizing his hidden camera technique, was able to capture drug dealers openly hawking and yelling out the price of cocaine to passerby. He also caught traffickers parading their semi-auto rifles and AK-47s on motorbikes. Even members of his team would capture some harrowing footage. The report was so detailed that it garnered significant attention, prompting Rio's political administration to respond. Police would launch crackdowns, disrupting drug dealers in Favela de Grota and other featured areas, temporarily halting drug sales on the streets and leading to several arrests. This dip in revenue angered the drug lords. On the other hand, for that report, Tim Lopes and the team received Brazil's highest journalism honor, making him the first investigative journalist to receive such an award. And as Lopes was just about to get some more groundbreaking stories, he was killed. Around noon on June 2, 2002, Lopes left his apartment, headed for one of Rio's lawless shanty towns. He'd received intel from local residents that traffickers promoting child prostitution in this area were hosting some kind of party, so Lopes wanted to check it out for himself. Now, these traffickers were sexually exploiting minors from communities, forcing them to put on provocative clothing for sex shows. And even worse, they would be performing sexual acts right there in the open. Now, residents had reported these traffickers to the police before, but nothing ever happened. Lopes was now their only hope to reach a wider audience and draw the attention of the Brazilian government. It was more or less like a job he wanted or needed to carry out. But before proceeding with this assignment, Lopes told his colleagues about his intentions to step away from the whole violence scene for a while. He just wanted to go on vacation with his wife and 19-year-old son, due to the alarming amount of death threats he was receiving. But for some reason, he delayed that vacation to plan out this last assignment, and not so ironically, it ended up truly being his last. After leaving his apartment, Lopes quickly stops by his office, where he left his phone and wallet, before heading to a mall, where he bought a tiny camera. He hid the camera around his waist and arrived at the location early. The party was to draw a crowd from other neighborhoods, so Lopes felt his presence wouldn't make him a target. Lopes walks into this bar and buys beer, before staging himself on a sidewalk as he watched and filmed traffickers driving by with their motorcycles. During this time, a young boy approaches him and asks him his name. Lopes naively tells him, unaware that this boy's an informant for local drug lords. They needed to confirm that this was Lopes. They needed to confirm it was him before sending their men out to get him, and their suspicions were confirmed when they noticed a small light coming from that camera concealed near his waist. Two men, Andre Capeta and Bezino, then approached Lopes as he sat alone. They made small talk, and Lopes didn't deny who he was. which led both men to beat him to a pulp right on the spot. Using a Nextel radio, they informed their boss, Elias Pereira da Silva, that Lopez was in their custody. They transported him in the trunk of their car to an isolated location, where his worst nightmare as a journalist finally became a reality. Upon arriving at their destination, they pulled Lopez out of that trunk and tie him to a tree. One of the men waiting for Lopez was a former victim of his reporting. Brazilian police had convicted him after Lopez named him in a report as a benefactor of drug sales in Rio. For this, he insisted that Lopez be killed, but not without a little torture. They burned his eyes with a cigarette, cut off his arms and legs with a sword, while watching him bleed profusely. Then they placed him between tires, doused in fuel, and set him ablaze.
Os restos de Tim Lopes foram encontrados dias depois. Dos 9 acusados de participação na morte do jornalista, uns foram presos e outros mortos pela polícia.
A couple of days later, law enforcement finds fragments of Lopez's bones at the scene after his family had reported him missing. One trafficker, who was later captured, revealed that about 20 of them had waited for Lopez, with 9 participating in this torture. Lopez's murder wasn't just disturbing to imagine, it was a shock to Brazil as a country. And on July 7th, 2002, a month after he was killed, Lopez's remains were gathered and buried at a cemetery.